With its mix of horror, humor, and 1980s cool, The Lost Boys, 1987, redefined the vampire genre. Packed with unforgettable performances, a killer soundtrack, and stylish visuals, this cult classic remains a fan favorite. But how much do you really know about it? From behind-the-scenes struggles to surprising casting choices and hidden details, here are 18 things you never knew about The Lost Boys. At first glance, The Lost Boys might seem tamer than many R-rated horror films of the 1980s. There's minimal swearing, no nudity, and a stylized, rock and roll aesthetic that makes it feel more like a thriller than a full-blown horror flick. But don't be fooled, its R rating was well earned, and according to Kiefer Sutherland, it could have been even bloodier. One of the most infamous scenes in the film is the biker massacre, where the vampires reveal their true nature in a brutal beachside attack. The finished version is already gruesome, but Sutherland revealed that the original cut was far more graphic. His character, David, was initially shown ripping off the back of a man's head, sending blood spraying everywhere. And the most unsettling part? He was directed to smile like a child eating birthday cake, a twisted contrast to the carnage unfolding on screen. The scene was ultimately toned down for the final cut, but even in its edited form, it remains one of the most chilling moments in the film. It cemented The Lost Boys as a horror classic, not just because of its stylish vampires, but because it wasn't afraid to sink its teeth into real terror. Transforming into a vampire in The Lost Boys wasn't just about fangs and attitude, it required painful sacrifices, especially when it came to contact lenses. Unlike today's soft, breathable lenses, the ones used in 1987 were thick, rigid, and highly uncomfortable. The actors could barely keep their eyes open while wearing them, and most could only endure them for a few seconds at a time. For Kiefer Sutherland and his fellow vampires, this was pure agony. One of the most iconic moments in the film, David's tearful reaction when his hand is burned by sunlight, wasn't acting. Sutherland was genuinely in pain from the scratchy, irritating lenses. His distress was so real that it ended up making the scene even more powerful. Despite the discomfort, these lenses added an unnerving, supernatural intensity to the vampire's transformations. Their glowing, predatory eyes became a defining visual of the film. But for the actors, it was a brutal reminder that being a vampire might look cool, but it definitely doesn't feel good. Big-budget horror films in the 1980s were known for their elaborate special effects, and The Lost Boys was supposed to be no different. Initially, Warner Brothers promised a much larger budget, allowing for high-tech vampire flight sequences and grand set pieces. But when funding was cut, director Joel Schumacher had to get creative. Instead of relying on expensive wire work and complicated CGI, which was still in its early days, Schumacher made a brilliant artistic choice: he never fully showed the vampires flying. Instead, he used a first-person perspective, making the audience see through the vampires' eyes as they soared through the night. This decision not only saved money but also heightened the suspense. By keeping the vampires' full abilities partially hidden, it made them feel even more powerful and mysterious. Rather than flashy effects, the film focused on atmosphere, tension, and character-driven horror. In the end, the budget constraints accidentally created one of the most effective and stylish vampire films of all time, proof that sometimes, less really is more. Every great movie starts with a script, and for The Lost Boys, that script came from Janice Fisher and James Jeremias, two writers making their Hollywood debut. Inspired by Peter Pan's Lost Boys, they reimagined the story with vampires instead of mischievous kids. The concept was fresh, unique, and exactly what studios were looking for. Their script sold for an impressive $400,000, a massive deal for first-time screenwriters. Initially, legendary director Richard Donner, Superman, The Goonies, was attached to direct, envisioning the film as a light-hearted, kid-friendly vampire adventure. However, when he got the chance to direct Lethal Weapon, he stepped aside, staying on as an executive producer. This opened the door for Joel Schumacher, who had a very different vision. Schumacher took the project in a darker, sexier direction, aging up the characters and leaning into 80s punk rock culture. His version turned The Lost Boys into a stylish, rebellious vampire film that perfectly captured the era. It was a risk, but one that paid off, cementing the film as a cult classic for generations to come. At its core, The Lost Boys is a twisted take on Peter Pan. In Neverland, the Lost Boys never grow up, and in Santa Carla, neither do the vampires. The idea of eternal youth is no longer a whimsical fantasy, but a dark curse, trapping these creatures in an endless cycle of violence, seduction, and bloodlust. The film's original concept was vastly different. It was pitched as Goonies vs. Vampires, with preteen protagonists and a lighter, more adventurous tone. But when Joel Schumacher took over, he saw a different vision. He aged up the vampires, turning them into rebellious, rock-and-roll outcasts, more akin to leather-clad rock stars than traditional horror villains. Instead of childish mischief, his vampires were dangerous, seductive, and deadly cool. This shift made The Lost Boys more than just a horror film. It became a cultural statement, blending punk aesthetics, 80s excess, and vampiric mythology into something truly unique. It was Peter Pan, but with fangs, motorcycles, and a killer soundtrack. Casting The Lost Boys was no easy task, and some of the actors who almost made the cut would have completely changed the film's tone. One of the most surprising near misses. Jim Carrey was considered for the role of David. Fresh off his comedic vampire movie Once Bitten, 1985, Carrey had the charisma, but ultimately, Kiefer Sutherland's brooding intensity won him the part. It's hard to imagine David with Carrey's signature over-the-top energy. It would have been a very different film. Meanwhile, a young Ben Stiller auditioned for an undisclosed role. Whether he was up for one of the Frog Brothers or another vampire remains a mystery, but he didn't make the final cut. And then there's Max, the seemingly harmless video store owner who turns out to be the real mastermind. The role almost went to Fred Gwynne, best known as Herman Munster from The Munsters. While Gwynne's towering presence would have made for an intimidating villain, the filmmakers ultimately chose Edward Herman, whose charming yet sinister performance made Max one of the most memorable twist villains of the 80s. Believe it or not, Jason Patric almost walked away from playing Michael. At the time, he wasn't interested in doing a vampire movie, feeling the genre was too campy and not serious enough for his career. But director Joel Schumacher wasn't willing to let him go that easily. To win him over, Schumacher made a rare offer. He gave Patric creative input on the film. This meant he could help shape his character and influence the overall tone. It was a bold move, but it worked. Patric signed on, and his presence helped ground The Lost Boys, making Michael's descent into the vampire world feel more emotional and believable. His influence didn't stop there. Schumacher originally wanted a blonde actress to play Star, but Patric pushed for Jamie Gertz, whom he had previously worked with in Solar Babies, 1986. His insistence led to Gertz landing the role, and their on-screen chemistry became one of the film's defining dynamics. In the end, the actor who almost said no became one of the biggest reasons why The Lost Boys remains an 80s classic. David, the menacing leader of The Lost Boys, had an unmistakable style, platinum blonde hair, a long black coat, and most notably, black leather gloves. At first glance, it seemed like a simple fashion choice, adding to his rebellious, rock-and-roll vampire persona. But in reality, those gloves were hiding something, a broken wrist. Halfway through filming, Kiefer Sutherland got into a motorcycle accident, seriously injuring his wrist. Rather than halting production, the filmmakers found a clever solution. They incorporated the gloves into his costume, making it a signature part of David's look. If you pay close attention, you'll even notice that in some scenes, he's wearing two different-sized gloves, one slightly larger to accommodate his injury. Despite the setback, Sutherland powered through filming, never letting the injury affect his performance. In fact, his effortless cool and menacing presence made David one of the most iconic vampires in movie history, wrist injury and all. The world of The Lost Boys wasn't just built through characters and storylines, it was packed with subtle details that added layers of meaning. One of the most clever touches. The posters scattered throughout the set, each carrying a hidden message for sharp-eyed fans. Inside the vampire's lair, a Doors poster hangs prominently on the wall. This wasn't just for decoration, it was a nod to the band's song, People Are Strange, which became the anthem for the film's misfit, outsider theme. The song itself plays early in the movie, reinforcing the eerie, dreamlike atmosphere of Santa Carla. Meanwhile, over in Sam's bedroom, another poster carries a deeper connection: Echo and the Bunnymen. This British band actually recorded the film's version of If People Are Strange, replacing the original Doors track in the official soundtrack. By featuring their poster in Sam's room, the filmmakers subtly linked the character to the music that underscored the film's dark, mysterious energy. These small but intentional details helped the Lost Boys create a fully immersive world, proving that even set design can tell a story. Corey Feldman was already a rising star by the time he was cast as Edgar Frog, but his off-screen struggles nearly cost him the role. On his very first day of filming, Feldman showed up hungover, still feeling the effects of a wild night before. His behavior was erratic, and he kept falling asleep between takes. Director Joel Schumacher wasn't having it. He immediately fired Feldman, making it clear that his unprofessionalism wouldn't be tolerated. But the next day, a humbled and apologetic Feldman returned to set, begging for a second chance. He promised to stay professional and take the role seriously. Schumacher decided to reinstate him, but on one condition: no more partying during filming. Feldman stuck to his word, staying sober for the rest of the shoot and delivering a standout performance as one of the film's most beloved characters. His portrayal of Edgar Frog became legendary, proving that sometimes, a second chance can lead to an unforgettable comeback. When Corey Feldman was cast as Edgar Frog, director Joel Schumacher didn't just want him to play a vampire hunter, he wanted him to be an 80s action hero. To prepare for the role, Schumacher told Feldman to study the performances of Sylvester Stallone in Rambo and Chuck Norris in Missing in Action. The goal? Edgar Frog wasn't just a kid battling vampires, he was a gritty, war-hardened soldier trapped in a teenager's body. This explains why Edgar and Alan Frog act like military commandos, delivering lines with dead serious intensity, despite the fact that they're just comic book nerds hunting the undead. Feldman took the direction to heart, lowering his voice and channeling every tough guy cliché into his performance. The result was intentionally over the top, turning Edgar into a parody of the ultimate action hero, complete with headbands, combat gear, and ridiculous one-liners. It was a bold creative choice, but one that worked, making the Frog brothers some of the most memorable vampire hunters in film history. Before The Lost Boys, Corey Feldman and Corey Haim had never worked together. But once they did, they became inseparable. This film marked the first time the two young actors shared the screen, launching a legendary Hollywood friendship that would define teen movies of the 80s and 90s. Playing Edgar Frog and Sam Emerson, Feldman and Haim brought a perfect mix of humor, energy, and charm to The Lost Boys. Their chemistry was instant, and audiences loved their dynamic. It didn't take long for Hollywood to take notice, and soon, they became known as the Two Coreys. Following The Lost Boys, the duo starred in a string of films together, including License to Drive, 1988, and Dream a Little Dream, 1989. Off-screen, their friendship was just as strong, making them one of the most iconic duos of the era. While their careers took different paths over time, The Lost Boys remains the film that started it all, forever cementing their place in pop culture history. At the end of The Lost Boys, the vampires are seemingly defeated, but one major detail hinted at a sequel. Unlike the other vampires, David's body never turned to dust. This wasn't an oversight, it was intentional, setting up his potential return in a follow-up film. The planned sequel? The Lost Girls, a new take on the vampire mythos featuring an all-female coven. The idea was to introduce a fresh group of vampires, likely just as rebellious and dangerous as David's gang, with his return possibly tying them to the original film. Given the massive popularity of the first movie, it seemed like a natural next step. Unfortunately, The Lost Girls never got off the ground. Whether it was studio hesitation, script issues, or simply bad timing, the project faded into development limbo. Instead, the direct-to-DVD sequels that came years later took a different direction, but many fans still wish they had seen The Lost Girls come to life. While The Lost Girls never materialized, The Lost Boys' story didn't end with the original film. Instead, it continued in comics, giving fans a new way to explore the world of Santa Carla's vampires. In 2008, Wildstorm Comics released Lost Boys, Reign of Frogs, a 4-issue miniseries that followed the Frog Brothers on new vampire hunting adventures. It was meant to bridge the gap between the original movie and the direct-to-DVD sequels. However, not all fans embraced it, and the story quickly faded into obscurity. Then, in 2016, DC Vertigo took a different approach. They launched a new 6-issue comic series, simply titled The Lost Boys, which ignored Reign of Frogs and instead served as a direct sequel to the 1987 film. This version reintroduced familiar characters while expanding the vampire mythology, even featuring a new generation of female vampires, drawing inspiration from the scrapped Lost Girls sequel. One of the most unforgettable moments in The Lost Boys is the train bridge scene, where David and his gang hang from the rails before mysteriously vanishing into the night. It's an eerie, suspenseful sequence that cements Michael's initiation into their vampire world. But despite the film being set in Santa Cruz, this legendary scene wasn't actually filmed there. Instead, the production used the Iron Horse Trailhead Trestle Bridge, located 40 miles north of Los Angeles. The bridge's isolated, industrial look made it the perfect setting for one of the movie's most haunting visuals. Today, the bridge is no longer a dangerous drop into the abyss. It's been converted into a pedestrian walkway, allowing fans to relive the moment where Michael was first tempted into the darkness. While Santa Cruz may be the official home of the Lost Boys, this hidden filming location remains a must-visit spot for die-hard fans. In The Lost Boys, the town of Santa Carla is infamously dubbed the murder capital of the world, a title that perfectly sets the stage for its dark, vampire-infested underbelly. But in reality, the film was actually shot in Santa Cruz, California. So why the name change? When city officials saw the script, they weren't thrilled about their town being associated with a wave of mysterious murders. They asked the filmmakers to alter the name, fearing it would hurt tourism and give Santa Cruz a bad reputation. Ironically, the nickname wasn't entirely fictional. In the 1970s, Santa Cruz did experience a string of real-life serial killer murders, earning an infamous reputation long before The Lost Boys was even written. 3 separate serial killers, Edmund Kemper, Herbert Mullen, and John Linley Frazier, terrorized the area, cementing its true crime legacy. While the movie's fictional vampires were pure fantasy, Santa Cruz's real history is far more chilling, proving that sometimes, the truth is scarier than fiction. Years before Marvel turned post-credit scenes into a blockbuster tradition, The Lost Boys almost had one of its own, one that would have added a haunting new layer to the story. The planned scene would have returned to the vampire's ruined lair, now deserted after the final battle. As the camera slowly panned across the wreckage, it would have revealed a hidden mural on the wall. The artwork, dated 1900, depicted Max, completely unchanged, his face frozen in time. This eerie detail would have confirmed what many fans already suspected: Max was far older than anyone realized. While the film presents him as a calm, calculating leader, this moment would have hinted at centuries of hidden darkness, suggesting he had been building his vampire empire for generations. Unfortunately, the scene was cut, leaving Max's true origins a mystery. But had it been included, it would have cemented him as one of the most sinister vampire masterminds in horror history. Despite The Lost Boys becoming a cult classic, fans hoping for a worthy sequel were left sorely disappointed. Instead of a theatrical follow-up, the franchise was revived through direct-to-DVD releases, The Tribe, 2008, and The Thirst, 2010. Both films attempted to recapture the magic of the original, but fell flat. Corey Feldman returned as Edgar Frog, still hunting vampires, but the rest of the original cast was absent. Corey Haim made a brief cameo in The Tribe, but his scene was cut from most versions due to his personal struggles at the time. Even Kiefer Sutherland's brother, Angus Sutherland, stepped in to play the lead vampire, but his performance lacked the menace and charisma that made David so iconic. Critics and fans panned the sequels, calling them cheap cash-ins with weak storytelling and forgettable villains. While the original Lost Boys remains an 80s horror masterpiece, these sequels are best left in the shadows. Decades later, The Lost Boys continues to captivate audiences with its unique blend of horror and comedy. Its influence can be seen in countless vampire films and TV shows that followed. Which fact surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into your favorite classic films.